Millions of fans revered Gladys Knight as the Queen of Soul, wielding ultimate power, but no one knew they were paying to hear the cries of a captive. Ironically, the love songs that propelled her to fame were sung from the chest of an exceptionally young bride suffocating in a highly restrictive marriage. Behind the glitz and glamour, Gladys was merely a desperate money-making machine, stripped of her possessions and human rights by her husband, Jimmy Newman. This nightmare began not with a forceful coercion, but with the calculated exploitation of a young performer's exhaustion. By 1960, a highly vulnerable Gladys was completely exhausted, carrying the heavy financial burden of her touring family band. Desperate for a protector to shield her from the grueling industry, she fell right into Newman's highly controlled dynamic. Newman offered the illusion of a safe traditional marriage, but the moment the certificate was signed, the reality of a strict overseer emerged. Newman did not view Gladys as an equal partner, nor did he intend to alleviate her burdens. He viewed her as a high-value asset that needed to be managed, monitored, and restricted. Newman recognized her rising fame and her status as a primary earner, not as a shared success, but as a direct threat to his masculine authority. The severe insecurity of a man married to a teenage prodigy quickly manifested as intense systemic management. He initiated a calculated process of isolation. He began monitoring her schedule, her interactions, and her movements with paranoid intensity. The control was not initially executed through overt physical confrontation. It was executed through meticulous psychological dominance. He dictated the terms of her daily life. He created a volatile domestic environment where his approval became the sole metric for her behavior. He utilized jealousy not as an uncontrollable emotion, but as a deliberate tactic to restrict her freedom. If she spoke to other musicians, he grew paranoid. If she spent too much time focusing on her career, the very career that kept them afloat, he became highly tense. Gladys found herself in a deeply contradictory and highly concerning position. On stage, under the hot lights, she was the powerful lead singer of the Pips, commanding the attention and respect of paying audiences. At home, she was a subordinated teenager walking on eggshells around a deeply insecure, volatile man. The refuge she sought from the music industry turned out to be far more oppressive and restrictive than the industry itself. She had traded the demanding contracts of promoters and managers for the absolute oversight of a husband. She was 16 years old, legally bound to a man who intended to dictate her every move, and the true, overwhelming mechanism of his control was about to be deployed. The mechanics of coercive influence rarely begin with physical confrontation. In the most sophisticated and destructive cases, the control is established through economics. For Gladys Knight, the transition from a 16-year-old bride to a heavily restricted wife was accelerated by a severe, systematic financial embargo. The reality of her marriage to James "Jimmy" Newman between 1960 and 1962 was defined by a bitter, inescapable paradox. She was the primary wealth generator for her extended family, yet she was deliberately stripped of all financial autonomy. Analyzing the financial infrastructure of the rhythm and blues industry in the early 1960s exposes the true depth of this economic restriction. Artists operating on the Chitlin circuit were frequently paid in cash at the end of a long, grueling week of performances. There were no direct deposits. There were no corporate human resource departments to ensure fair labor practices. The money was tangible, handed over in dressing rooms or backstage corridors by club promoters. Gladys Knight, at 16 and 17 years old, was the vocal engine driving the Pips. She stood under the hot stage lights night after night, singing until her vocal cords frayed, navigating difficult, segregated environments to earn that cash. She was performing the labor of a seasoned adult professional. However, when the performances ended and the payment was issued, the money did not belong to her. Jimmy Newman intercepted the fruits of her labor. He recognized that financial independence is the natural enemy of dependency. If Gladys possessed her own capital, she possessed the means to escape. She could hire a taxi to take her to an airport. She could rent a hotel room. She could hire legal representation. To prevent any possibility of departure, Newman withheld her earnings. He assumed total financial management over the household finances, reducing the breadwinner of the family to an economic dependent. The psychological toll of this fiscal restriction was profound. Gladys was forced to ask her husband for basic necessities, using the very money she had sacrificed her physical and mental health to earn. If she needed a new dress for a performance, she had to seek his approval. If she wanted to purchase food while traveling between tour stops, she had to justify the expense to the man who was keeping her pockets empty. Newman weaponized her own labor against her, creating a dynamic where she was perpetually working to fund her own isolation. She was a human financial engine, generating wealth that she was strictly forbidden to touch. This financial paralysis was coupled with a suffocating atmosphere of paranoid jealousy. Newman was a man entirely consumed by his own insecurity. He was acutely aware that he was married to a prodigy whose star was rapidly rising. Instead of supporting her trajectory, he viewed her success as a direct threat to his authority. He believed that her exposure to the public, her interactions with male musicians, and her growing fame would eventually lead her to realize she did not need him. To counter this perceived threat, Newman constructed a psychological barrier. He monitored her schedule with obsessive scrutiny. He alienated her from her peers. He dictated who she was allowed to speak with and heavily restricted her social interactions outside of her immediate family and bandmates. If she received a compliment from a fan or a fellow artist, Newman reacted with volatile hostility. The home they shared became a highly tense environment where his unpredictable temper dictated the atmosphere. Gladys learned to walk on eggshells, constantly calibrating her behavior to avoid triggering his paranoia. She was subjected to relentless mental games designed to erode her confidence and reinforce the false narrative that she was incapable of surviving without his management and protection. While Gladys was slowly struggling inside this engineered isolation, the music industry was actively observing her deterioration. It is a critical historical error to assume that the executives and managers surrounding her were ignorant of her situation. Between 1960 and 1962, the Pips were navigating the turbulent waters of independent record labels. Before they found their permanent, highly sanitized home at Motown Records, they were contracted to labels like Huntum Records, VJ Records, and Fury Records. Fury Records was owned by Bobby Robinson, a veteran Harlem-based record producer and executive. Men like Robinson and the regional tour promoters who booked the Pips were not naive. They were sharp, observant businessmen who understood the psychology of their artists. They saw the bags under Gladys's eyes. They witnessed the nervous, fearful energy she projected when she stepped off the stage and prepared to return to her husband. They observed the reality of a 17-year-old girl appearing increasingly gaunt, exhausted, and emotionally drained. Yet the system operated on a doctrine of revenue-driven apathy. The internal corporate logic of the 1960s music industry was brutally simple. The personal well-being of the artist is irrelevant as long as the artist continues to produce marketable commodities. No label executive intervened. No tour manager pulled Newman aside to establish boundaries. There was no institutional support system for a teenage girl trapped in a highly tense marriage. The industry collectively decided that intervening in a domestic issue was bad for business. Confronting a volatile husband could disrupt the recording schedule. It could cancel tour dates. It could impact the bottom line. The executives chose willful blindness. They looked at a restricted teenager and saw only a voice that could be pressed onto vinyl and sold for a profit. They tacitly endorsed her subordination by prioritizing their quarterly earnings over her fundamental human rights. They expected her to endure the strain, but they demanded she do it quietly and only after the vocal tracks had been successfully recorded. This corporate complicity culminated in one of the most profound sonic illusions in the history of rhythm and blues. In 1961, the Pips recorded a song that would become their first major national success. The track was a re-recording of an earlier R&B song titled "Every Beat of My Heart." When the record was released, it resonated deeply with the public. It climbed to number 1 on the R&B charts and broke into the top 10 of the Billboard Hot 100. Audiences across the United States and eventually across the Atlantic fell in love with the track. The song is a slow, methodical doo-wop ballad. Gladys Knight's lead vocal is smooth, rich, and deeply emotive. The lyrics speak of a profound, all-consuming romantic longing. She sings about sending her love across the distance, driven by the rhythmic pounding of her own heart. To the millions of people who purchased the record and played it on their turntables, it was a masterpiece of romantic devotion. Analyzing the track through the lens of historical reality reveals a deeply disturbing dissonance. The public was consuming a masterfully packaged illusion. The smooth, soaring vocals on that piece of vinyl were not born from the euphoria of young love. They were the highly disciplined professional output of a 17-year-old girl living in a state of perpetual anxiety. When Gladys stood in the vocal booth and sang about the beating of her heart, the reality behind that biological response was entirely unromantic. The rapid heartbeat she experienced in her daily life was the physiological symptom of panic. It was the adrenaline spike that occurred every time she heard the front door of her house click shut, knowing she was locked inside with her controlling partner. It was the suffocating anxiety of a teenager who knew that any wrong word, any misplaced glance, or any missing dollar from her performance fee could trigger an explosive reaction from Newman. The recording of "Every Beat of My Heart" is a prime example of the industry's ability to commodify hardship. The executives at Fury and VJ Records capitalized on her raw, desperate energy. They took the genuine pain and exhaustion of a restricted minor, wrapped it in a beautiful orchestral arrangement, and sold it to teenagers at record shops as a love song. The public unwittingly funded the continuation of her psychological containment with every record they purchased, while the executives collected the majority of the royalties and Jimmy Newman confiscated whatever fractions made it back to her pocket. As 1961 transitioned into 1962, the architecture of Newman's control required a final permanent anchor. Psychological intimidation and financial confiscation are highly effective tools, but they can occasionally be circumvented. To ensure that Gladys would never find the logistical or emotional capacity to walk away, the trap had to be completely sealed. In 1962, Gladys Knight, at the age of 18, gave birth to their first child, James Newman Jr. The introduction of motherhood into this volatile equation was profoundly disruptive to her independence. Raising a child is a monumental task under optimal conditions. For Gladys, it functioned as the ultimate binding agent to her overseer. She was now an 18-year-old carrying the responsibilities of 3 distinct, grueling lifetimes. First, she remained the primary financial engine for her extended family and her husband, required to maintain a punishing schedule of live performances and studio sessions. The Chitlin circuit did not offer maternity leave. The promoters still expected the Empress of Soul to hit her marks and deliver the high-energy performances the crowds paid to see. Second, she was a new mother experiencing the intense physical exhaustion and emotional vulnerability that accompanies caring for an infant. She had to navigate the logistics of childcare while traveling, or suffer the agonizing separation of leaving her newborn behind while she worked to feed him. Third, and most devastatingly, she was still a severely restricted individual in her own home. The birth of a child is often leveraged by controlling partners to escalate their dominance. Newman now had the ultimate leverage. If she ever entertained the thought of fleeing, the logistics were no longer just about sneaking out a door. They involved safely extracting a vulnerable infant from a highly tense environment without access to independent funds. The child tethered her to Newman with an unbreakable biological and moral chain. The year 1962 marked the lowest point of her subordination. Gladys Knight was 18 years old, a mother, a national recording star, and a completely isolated individual. She was surrounded by thousands of adoring fans who screamed her name, and she was surrounded by industry professionals who managed her career, yet she was completely, terrifyingly alone. The system had successfully isolated her, stripped her of her resources, and bound her to a man who intended to keep her in the dark permanently. The barrier was locked, the key was destroyed, and the music industry simply turned up the volume on the amplifiers to drown out the silence of her isolation. The year 1963 arrived, bringing with it a profound cultural and political turbulence across the United States. It was the year of the March on Washington, a year of shifting paradigms and demands for fundamental human rights. Yet, for 19-year-old Gladys Knight, the fight for emancipation was not occurring on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. It was happening in the intense enclosed space of her own home. She was a national recording artist, a mother, and a primary breadwinner, but she was fundamentally trapped in an environment defined by severe psychological pressure and absolute financial restriction. Human endurance, however, is not an infinite resource. There is a precise biological and psychological threshold where the instinct to survive finally overrides the conditioned compliance of isolation. For Gladys, reaching this threshold was not marked by a single cinematic explosion of defiance. It was a slow, agonizing process of internal awakening, catalyzed by the presence of her infant son, James Newman Jr. The introduction of a child into a difficult environment fundamentally alters the calculus of the affected individual. When Gladys was only responsible for herself, Newman's systematic dismantling of her self-esteem had been highly effective. He had successfully convinced her that the outside world was too dangerous, that the music industry would devour her without his protection, and that her intrinsic value was tied entirely to her obedience to him. She had accepted the severe limitations placed upon her because she had been conditioned to believe she deserved nothing more. But a mother looking at her newborn child does not see the world through the lens of her own defeated ego. She sees a blank slate. She sees a life that has not yet been compromised. As Gladys watched her son grow in an atmosphere thick with paranoia, jealousy, and unspoken threats, a terrifying realization crystallized in her mind. If she remained in this marriage, her son would absorb the dynamics of their household as the baseline for normal human interaction. He would learn that a man's role is to dictate and control, and that a woman's role is to surrender her autonomy, her finances, and her voice to maintain the peace. The psychological barrier would not just contain her, it would eventually close around her child. This maternal clarity initiated a critical shift in the power dynamic. To break a system of coercive influence, the restricted individual must first recognize the fundamental vulnerability of the controlling figure. For 3 years, Jimmy Newman had operated under the illusion of absolute power. He held the money, he dictated the schedules, he controlled the narrative, but his power was entirely derivative. He was a parasite attached to a massive vocal engine. He did not generate the wealth, he merely intercepted it. He did not command the attention of the recording executives. He merely stood in the shadow of the woman who did. Gladys began to understand the raw mechanics of her own leverage. The entire infrastructure of their lives, the food on the table, the clothes they wore, the status Newman enjoyed in his own mind, was entirely dependent on her willingness to stand in front of a microphone and sing. If the vocal cords stopped vibrating, the cash flow ceased to exist. She was the asset. He was the liability. Understanding this leverage, however, did not immediately solve the logistical nightmare of her situation. The economic embargo Newman had established was severe. Planning an exit requires capital. It requires the ability to secure alternative housing, to purchase transportation, and to feed a child during the transition period. Gladys possessed none of these things. Every dollar she earned from the grueling performances on the Chitlin circuit was confiscated. She was a famous singer living in a state of engineered poverty. The decision to leave, therefore, required a terrifying acceptance of absolute zero. She had to make peace with the fact that escaping her husband meant leaving behind every material possession she had worked to acquire. She had to accept that walking out the door meant stepping into a financial void, with a baby in her arms and no safety net to catch her. It was a choice between remaining in a secure, funded enclosure or stepping into the terrifying, impoverished unknown of freedom. The mental preparation for such an act requires immense psychological fortitude. Gladys had to mask her internal awakening. In a household defined by hypervigilance and paranoid monitoring, any sudden change in behavior, any display of newfound confidence, or any deviation from her conditioned compliance would have immediately triggered Newman's suspicion and likely resulted in a severe escalation of his control tactics. She had to perform the role of the defeated, obedient wife while secretly mapping the architecture of her escape. She had to compartmentalize her terror, storing her plans in the absolute silence of her own mind. When the moment of departure finally arrived in 1963, it was not accompanied by the dramatic fanfare one might expect from a Hollywood script. Escaping a highly controlled environment is rarely loud. It is characterized by an urgent, breathless silence. The precise details of the day she left remain locked in the private trauma of her past, but the mechanics of such an exit are universal. It involves waiting for the exact moment the overseer is distracted. It involves gathering only what can be carried in two hands because anything more would slow down the escape. It involves walking out of the front door with the terrifying knowledge that if the timing is wrong, the consequences will be devastating. Gladys Knight walked out of the house. She carried her son, James Jr. She did not carry a bank book. She did not carry the master tapes to her hit records. She left the financial fruits of her teenage years in the hands of the man who had stolen her youth. She walked into the streets of 1963 with empty pockets, a fractured psychology, and the heavy, terrifying weight of absolute responsibility. The immediate aftermath of the separation was a masterclass in survival. The illusion that fame equates to protection was instantly shattered. The music industry, which had eagerly profited from her voice and capitalized on her manufactured image, offered no sanctuary. The executives at Fury Records and VJ Records did not care that their lead artist was suddenly a single teenage mother fleeing a highly restrictive environment. They did not offer legal counsel or financial advances to secure her safety. Their only concern was the recording schedule and the fulfillment of tour contracts. To the men in the boardrooms, the dissolution of Gladys's marriage was not a human crisis. It was a potential logistical inconvenience. If she missed a studio session because she was scrambling to find safe housing, it cost them money. If she canceled a performance because she could not secure childcare, it damaged their relationships with regional promoters. The industry demanded that she compartmentalize her trauma with absolute efficiency. She was expected to leave the terror of her domestic collapse at the stage door, put on the sequined gown, and deliver the flawless high-energy R&B performances the public demanded. This is the brutal reality of the entertainment machine. It is an apparatus designed to extract maximum value from the artist while accepting zero responsibility for the human being. Gladys was forced to navigate the incredibly complex legal and emotional process of a divorce while maintaining the grueling pace of a touring musician. She had to stand on stage night after night, singing songs of heartbreak and longing, while internally processing the profound trauma of her own shattered life. The public cheered for the emotion in her voice, completely unaware that the grit and the sorrow they were applauding were the direct result of her recent desperate fight for survival. The divorce proceedings were finalized in 1963. On paper, the marriage was dissolved. The legal tether to James Jimmy Newman was severed. Gladys Knight was officially a free woman, but the word freedom in this context is highly relative. She was 19 years old. She was a divorced, single mother operating in a deeply conservative, patriarchal society that stigmatized women for failed marriages regardless of the circumstances. She was financially ruined, having sacrificed her earnings to secure her physical safety. Furthermore, breaking a psychological barrier does not immediately heal the mind of the affected individual. The invisible architecture of Newman's control lingered in her nervous system. The hypervigilance, the fear of sudden anger, the conditioned belief that she was constantly being evaluated and judged, these invisible scars did not vanish when the judge signed the divorce decree. She had to actively deprogram her own mind, a process that would take years of silent internal struggle. Yet, despite the overwhelming devastation of her circumstances, the year 1963 marked the most significant victory of her life. She had looked at the massive, intimidating structure of her captivity, and she had chosen to walk through the fire rather than burn slowly inside it. She had defied the man who believed he owned her, and she had defied the industry that believed she was merely a voiceless asset. She stood in the wreckage of her teenage years, looking at a future that was completely uncertain and heavily burdened. She had no money, no powerful protectors, and a child relying entirely on her ability to survive. But as she looked at her son, and as she felt the silence of a room where she was no longer being monitored, a new, indestructible foundation was laid. She was no longer a frightened 16-year-old bride looking for a savior. She was a 19-year-old survivor who had become her own protector. The industry had not yet seen the true extent of her power. They had capitalized on the voice of a compliant, terrified girl. They were completely unprepared for the vocal force of a woman who had just fought a war for her own autonomy and won. The chapter of her subordination was closed. The era of the true empress was about to begin, but the executives in the boardrooms were about to launch a massive, coordinated campaign to ensure that the public never knew the price she paid to wear the crown. The dissolution of a marriage on paper does not instantly repair the logistical and financial ruins left in its wake. In the immediate aftermath of 1963, 19-year-old Gladys Knight found herself navigating a harsh, unforgiving terrain. She had successfully extracted herself and her infant son from a highly controlled, hostile domestic environment. But her victory was accompanied by severe economic instability. She was a single mother operating in a society that offered little grace to women in her position, and she was doing so while chained to an industry that demanded absolute perfection. Her career with the Pips was her only viable mechanism for survival. The group continued to tour, grinding through the demanding schedules of the rhythm and blues circuit, but they were searching for a permanent, stable infrastructure. They needed a machine that could elevate them from regional successes to global icons. In 1966, that machine opened its doors to them. Gladys Knight and the Pips signed a contract with Motown Records. Relocating to Detroit and entering the Motown ecosystem marked a total paradigm shift in her professional trajectory. Motown, under the precise and demanding direction of Berry Gordy, was not merely a record label. It was an industrial assembly line for cultural icons. Gordy's stated objective was to produce the sound of young America. To achieve this, he required his artists to possess a crossover appeal that could penetrate the racially segregated pop charts and land in the living rooms of mainstream affluent audiences. This corporate strategy relied heavily on aggressive image management. Motown executives understood that talent alone was insufficient to break the racial barriers of 1960s commercial radio and television. The artists had to project an image of pristine, untouchable elegance. They were enrolled in the label's internal artist development department, overseen by the legendary Maxine Powell. Powell operated a strict finishing school within the Motown headquarters. She taught artists from rough working-class backgrounds how to walk, how to sit, how to hold a microphone, and, most importantly, how to speak to the press. When Gladys Knight entered this highly controlled corporate environment, her history presented a significant public relations problem. The architects of the Motown image surveyed her background and immediately recognized a liability. The corporate narrative required a flawless, aspirational queen. It required the Empress of Soul. What they had in front of them was a 22-year-old woman who had already survived a harrowing 3-year psychological containment, who had been systematically stripped of her finances by a controlling partner, and who was now raising a child alone. In the boardroom logic of the 1960s entertainment industry, a dark history of domestic isolation was not viewed as a testament to human resilience. It was viewed as unmarketable baggage. The executives did not want the record-buying public to associate their elegant new star with the gritty, terrifying realities of a highly restricted youth. They feared that acknowledging her past would shatter the carefully constructed illusion of effortless glamour. Consequently, a deliberate, institutional campaign of historical sanitization was executed. The PR machinery of Motown effectively erased the years between 1960 and 1963 from her official biography. When press releases were drafted, her first marriage was either entirely omitted or glossed over as a brief, inconsequential, youthful mistake. When she sat down for interviews with journalists, she was heavily coached to pivot away from any questions regarding her early personal life. She was trained to smile, to maintain a regal posture, and to redirect the conversation strictly to the music, her family bandmates, and the future. The psychological weight of this corporate mandate was immense. Gladys Knight was being paid to sing soul music, a genre fundamentally rooted in the authentic expression of human struggle and triumph. Yet the very institution that profited from her soulful delivery forbade her from speaking about the exact experiences that forged her vocal depth. She was required to live a double life, projecting the image of a flawless, untroubled aristocrat in public while privately carrying the heavy, invisible scars of a woman who had fought a war for her own autonomy. The industry effectively locked her history in a vault, turning the man who had stolen her teenage years into an invisible ghost. But history and the rigid laws of cause and effect cannot be permanently suppressed by a press department. While Gladys Knight was ascending to the highest echelons of global fame, wearing bespoke gowns and performing on national television, a very different trajectory was unfolding for the man she had left behind. Yet, the ghost of those 3 years remained subtly woven into the fabric of her career. Motown could sanitize the press releases, but they could not sanitize the vocal cords. When Gladys Knight stepped up to the microphone to record her most iconic tracks under the Motown banner, songs like I Heard It Through the Grapevine and Neither One of Us wants to be the first to say goodbye, the delivery possessed a maturity and a devastating gravitas that could not be taught in Maxine Powell's finishing school. The public listened to her perform these tracks and marveled at her ability to convey complex, layered sorrow. They heard a woman who understood the painful mechanics of human attachment and the terrifying prospect of letting go. What the listeners did not realize was that she was drawing from a very specific, deeply hidden reservoir. When she sang about heartbreak, she was not referencing standard romantic disappointment. She was tapping into the muscle memory of a 19-year-old girl walking out of a hostile house with no money and a baby in her arms. She was channeling the residual anxiety of a stolen youth. She took the darkest, most heavily guarded chapter of her life and transmuted it into high art. The industry may have forced her to keep her past a secret, but she found a way to broadcast the emotional truth of it to millions of people, hiding the evidence of her survival in plain sight, directly inside the grooves of the vinyl records. The human brain is an incredibly highly adaptive organ. When an individual survives a prolonged period of severe psychological restriction and total financial restriction, their internal wiring permanently alters. They do not simply return to a state of baseline normalcy once the immediate threat is removed. Instead, they develop a profound, almost radar-like sensitivity to the mechanics of control. For Gladys Knight, the trauma inflicted during her teenage marriage did not evaporate when James Jimmy Newman disappeared from her life. It fundamentally shaped the way she navigated the rest of her career, transforming her from a vulnerable, trusting teenager into one of the most formidable and guarded businesswomen in the entertainment industry. Viewing her professional decisions through the lens of her stolen youth clarifies her trajectory after the Motown era. The Motown machine, while providing global fame and a platform for her undeniable talent, operated on a system of intense corporate paternalism. Berry Gordy's empire controlled the masters, the publishing rights, and the overall financial architecture of its artists' careers. The label executives dictated what songs were recorded when they were released and how the revenue was distributed, often utilizing opaque accounting practices that heavily favored the corporation over the creator. Many artists operating within this system accepted these terms without question, blinded by the glamour, the television appearances, and the prestige of the Motown brand. They trusted the executives to manage their livelihoods. Gladys Knight, however, possessed a distinct, hard-earned advantage. She had already survived an absolute controller. Having lived through a marriage where an insecure overseer confiscated her cash earnings and stripped her of all economic autonomy, Gladys was uniquely equipped to recognize the subtle, polished mechanics of corporate financial subjugation. She looked at the contracts, the royalty statements, and the restrictive creative mandates, and she recognized a highly sanitized, legally binding version of the exact same control structure she had escaped in 1963. She recognized the feeling of generating immense wealth while being systematically denied access to the vault. She was no longer the 16-year-old girl who believed that surrendering control was the price of security. She was a grown woman, a mother, and a seasoned veteran of the Chitlin circuit who understood the raw value of her own vocal cords. Consequently, her relationship with the Motown executives was characterized by a quiet, unyielding friction. While other artists courted the favor of the board members, Gladys Knight and the Pips operated with a highly protective, self-reliant independence. They fulfilled their contractual obligations, delivered massive hits, and maintained the pristine public image required of them, but they never fully surrendered their internal agency to the machine. In 1973, this internal friction culminated in a decisive structural rebellion. Gladys Knight executed a maneuver that shocked the music establishment. She led the Pips out of the Motown empire, leaving the most powerful record label in the world at the peak of its cultural dominance was viewed by many industry insiders as professional ruin. But Gladys was not operating on ego. She was operating on a survival instinct, honed in the darkest chapter of her life. She negotiated a new contract with Buddha Records, a smaller, less prestigious label. The industry pundits questioned the move, failing to understand the underlying mathematics of her decision. Buddha Records offered something far more valuable to a survivor of financial isolation than prestige. They offered better royalty rates, greater creative control, and a transparent financial structure. By walking away from Motown, Gladys Knight proved that she would never again allow an external entity, whether a paranoid husband or a billion-dollar corporation, to dictate the terms of her existence or withhold the capital generated by her own labor. At Buddha Records, the group recorded the defining anthem of their career, Midnight Train to Georgia. The track won Grammy Awards, topped the charts, and solidified their legacy entirely outside the shadow of Berry Gordy. She had reclaimed the economic reins of her own life, ensuring that the financial vulnerability that kept her trapped at 17 would never be replicated. Yet securing financial independence does not immediately erase the silent internal architecture of a stolen youth. The psychological residue of those 3 years remained a permanent fixture in her reality. When an individual is forced to assume the responsibilities of a primary breadwinner at 16 and is subsequently subjected to a highly tense, paranoid domestic environment, the natural developmental stage of adolescence is entirely bypassed. Gladys never experienced the careless, experimental years of being a teenager. She was thrust directly from childhood into a high-stakes arena of adult survival. This forced acceleration resulted in a lifelong hypervigilance. Those who worked closely with Gladys Knight throughout the 1970s and 1980s noted her absolute unwavering demand for professionalism and her fiercely protective stance over her family and bandmates. She operated with the intense, calculated discipline of a general commanding a battlefield. There was no room for error, no tolerance for exploitation, and an absolute zero-tolerance policy for anyone attempting to undermine her authority. She built a fortress of competence around herself, utilizing her immense talent and business acumen as a shield to ensure no one could ever corner her again. But a fortress, no matter how magnificent, is still a type of confinement. For decades, Gladys maintained the code of silence imposed by the industry regarding her first marriage. The media narrative remained unbroken. She was the flawless Empress, born into royalty, gliding through the decades without a single misstep. The ghost of Jimmy Newman remained locked in the basement of her history. She carried the secret of her teenage isolation quietly, protecting the pristine image that the public demanded and the industry required. However, historical narratives are not static. As the 20th century drew to a close, the cultural landscape began to shift. The rigid, sanitized PR machinery of the 1960s gave way to a public that increasingly valued authenticity, vulnerability, and the unvarnished truth. The stigma surrounding those who had survived coercive control and psychological containment began very slowly to dismantle. In the late 1990s, Gladys Knight made a calculated, monumental decision. She decided that the statute of limitations on the industry's enforced silence had expired. She realized that by protecting the pristine, sanitized image of the Empress, she was actively participating in the erasure of the 16-year-old girl who had fought so desperately to keep her alive. She recognized that true authority does not stem from projecting a false perfection. It stems from owning the totality of one's history, including the scars. She sat down to write her autobiography, appropriately titled Between Each Line of Pain and Glory. Publishing a memoir for a legacy artist is often a perfunctory exercise in self-congratulation, a collection of tour anecdotes, celebrity encounters, and polite reflections. Gladys Knight's book was none of these things. It was a precise, targeted deconstruction of the corporate myth that had surrounded her for 40 years. When the book was released in 1997, the music industry and her global fan base were forced to confront a shocking reality. Gladys systematically laid out the facts of her life between 1960 and 1963. She did not use flowery, dramatic language. She laid out the mechanics of her early marriage with clinical precision. She detailed the extreme jealousy, the absolute financial embargo, and the terrifying psychological isolation she endured while simultaneously acting as the lead singer of a national touring act. By putting these facts into print, Gladys executed the final, ultimate victory over James Jimmy Newman. For 3 years, he had operated under the assumption that he could control her reality in the dark without consequence. He believed he could confiscate her wealth and crush her spirit, and that the world would never know. And for decades, the music industry had validated that assumption by sweeping his actions under the rug to protect their product. By publishing the truth, Gladys dragged his ghost out of the shadows and exposed the precise nature of his dominance to the light of history. She stripped away his anonymity. She ensured that the historical record would forever document him not as a husband, but as a controlling figure who attempted to extinguish a generational talent. Furthermore, her confession served as a damning indictment of the entertainment system that had facilitated her isolation. By detailing the timeline, she forced the public to realize that the industry executives, the tour promoters, and the managers of the early 1960s had all been fully aware of her deterioration. She exposed the cold transactional nature of a business that watched a 17-year-old girl wither away under severe psychological pressure and chose to do absolutely nothing as long as she hit her high notes and generated ticket sales. The publication of the book shattered the illusion of the flawless empress, but it replaced it with something infinitely more powerful. The public did not turn away in disappointment. Instead, the revelation deepened their reverence for her. The audience realized that the immense, soul-stirring depth of her vocal delivery was not a manufactured studio trick. It was the authentic physical manifestation of a woman who had been to the absolute edge of human endurance and had clawed her way back. When the public finally absorbed the truth documented in her autobiography, the entire discography of Gladys Knight underwent a radical retroactive transformation. For decades, listeners had consumed her music passively. They had played her records at dinner parties, during long drives, and in moments of romantic reflection. They had accepted the corporate narrative that she was simply a gifted vocalist, possessing a naturally melancholic tone. But the revelation of her history, the 3 years of severe psychological confinement and absolute financial confiscation, demanded a complete reevaluation of her art. The publication of her truth permanently altered the acoustics of her legacy. It forced the audience and the music historians to confront the uncomfortable reality of what they had actually been listening to all those years. Revisiting the foundational tracks of her career with this new, unvarnished context exposes the mechanics of this paradigm shift. Consider again the 1961 release of Every Beat of My Heart. For nearly 40 years, this song existed in the cultural consciousness as a standard, innocent rhythm and blues ballad. It was viewed as the launch pad for the Pips, a sweet melody about romantic devotion. But when you place that vinyl record on a turntable today, armed with the knowledge of what was occurring behind closed doors, the song fundamentally changes its shape. It ceases to be a love song. It becomes an audio documentary of a highly controlled situation. Listen closely to the phrasing. Listen to the specific trembling resonance in her lower register. The girl singing into that studio microphone was 17 years old. She was not dreaming of a distant lover. She was trapped in a highly volatile house with a man who intercepted every dollar she earned. When she hit the high notes, she was not expressing the soaring euphoria of romance. She was executing a flawless professional performance while carrying the crushing silent terror of a youth entirely stripped of its autonomy. The smooth, velvety vocals that the public purchased in the millions were, in stark reality, the choked, heavily disguised cries of a teenager operating under strict psychological containment. This is the ultimate disturbing paradox of the soul music industry. The genre is marketed on its authenticity. The record executives sell the grit, the pain, and the deep emotional resonance of their artists. They package sorrow and sell it as entertainment. Yet, the same executives who profited from the sorrow in Gladys Knight's voice were the exact men who looked the other way while her sorrow was being actively manufactured by a controlling husband. They loved the sound of her breaking heart on the master tapes, but they had absolutely no interest in helping her fix it in reality. They sanitized her biography to protect their investment, ensuring that the consumer never had to feel guilty about funding the isolation of a teenage prodigy. But the industry's attempt to rewrite history ultimately failed because history is governed by a ruthless, unavoidable law of cause and effect. The architects of control rarely survive the collapse of their own systems. This brings us to the final ledger of James Jimmy Newman. The man who attempted to build a kingdom by isolating a young girl and confiscating her wealth was ultimately destroyed by his own hollow architecture. The timeline of his demise is the perfect execution of historical karma. His decline was rapid and absolute. The music industry, which had only tolerated him as a necessary obstacle to access Gladys, discarded him without a second thought. He was banished to the absolute fringes of society. Only a few years after the divorce was finalized, Jimmy Newman's body surrendered to the ravages of his lifestyle. He died from illness, compounded by severe addiction. He passed away in complete obscurity. There were no global headlines. There were no tributes from record executives. The man who had once possessed the power to dictate the every movement of the future Empress of Soul ended his life as a nameless, forgotten statistic in the dark. He attempted to extinguish a generational light, and instead, he was swallowed entirely by his own shadow. Contrast that pathetic, isolated conclusion with the majestic permanence of Gladys Knight. She did not just survive the financial embargo and the psychological intimidation of her teenage years. She utilized the discipline forged in that dark environment to conquer an industry designed to exploit her. She walked away from the most powerful record label in the world to secure her own financial independence. She built a massive, enduring enterprise on her own terms. She won 7 Grammy Awards. She was inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. She raised her children. She secured her wealth. Most importantly, she reclaimed the ownership of her own story. By speaking the truth, she took the final weapon out of the hands of the executives who tried to keep her quiet, and she retroactively rescued the 16-year-old girl they had all abandoned. She wears the title Empress of Soul, not because it was a clever marketing term assigned to her by a public relations department, but because she earned it through the brutal, unrelenting act of governing her own survival. An empress is a sovereign ruler. Gladys Knight became the sovereign ruler of her own life the moment she walked out of that house with her infant son and nothing else. The legacy of Gladys Knight is a testament to the indestructible nature of the human will. It proves that while a controller can confiscate a bank account and restrict physical movement, they cannot permanently silence a voice that is destined to echo across generations. The cage rusted, the overseer perished, and the bird flew higher than anyone in the industry ever thought possible. But as we celebrate her triumph, we must also hold the mirror up to the machinery that surrounds the music. Gladys Knight bravely confronted her darkest past, using the deep wounds of her 16th year to forge some of the greatest soul records in human history. She definitively defeated the man who stole her freedom. But we, as the audience and the consumers of culture, must never forget how the entertainment system actively ignored the silent screams of a trapped youth simply to keep the vinyl records spinning and the cash registers ringing. The industry demanded her soul, but refused to protect her humanity.